here, I promise. I got one more chance here to address some of the things that Mr. Spees said. Maybe, possibly, shopping at Westdale Mall at some point in time, maybe possibly within 1979, maybe possibly around Christmas, maybe in that year, and maybe there being some kind of event that involves some sort of transfer, maybe possibly, is not reasonable doubt. It's within the realm of possibilities. But what isn't? Defense says that there are a couple things that we can't show, that the state hasn't shown. We can't conclude that that's Jerry Burns' blood on F5 or the shift selector. I explained to you during the closing argument how we did, and I'll touch on that again here in a moment. But that's not an element of murder in the first degree. They said we can't conclude how it arrived on the gear shift or on the dress. We did. I talked about that in our closing argument. I'll hit on that again really quick too. But that's not an element of murder in the first degree. When you were shown the definition of reasonable doubt just moments ago, and you were led down that definition, it kept going back to one description of a person in a court, a juror who makes a decision, a reasonable person. What causes a reasonable person to hesitate to act? What evidence would convince a reasonable person of the defendant's guilt? And folks, looking around here, you look like some reasonable people to me. Within that definition of the jury instructions I mentioned before, it requires you look at evidence, not possibilities. Sat here and watched the defense give their closing argument, made some good points. That's to be expected. But nowhere in there did we hear any, to use their word, scintilla or minuscule amount of reasonable doubt in this case from the evidence. You can use that word all you want, scintilla, minute, minutia. That's still more reasonable doubt than has been created in this case. Defense says DNA can tell us what we are. Yes, that's true. But they can't tell us who we are. That's probably true too. But I disagree with the fact, or with the assertion that DNA can't tell us where we've been. In fact, that's the defense's whole case. So when they say that to you, that's just not true. It can tell us where we've been. And the DNA in this case showed where Mr. Burns was. In a car where Michelle Martinko was murdered, not once, but twice. We disagree that the evidence in this case took some kind of divergent turn that has led wrongly to the defendant. The evidence in this case points and is directed in one path, through one path that's not divergent at all and never diverges from the conclusion based on the evidence that the defendant is guilty of this crime of murder in the first degree. State gets a rebuttal because we had the burden of proof. And that's what we want. That's the way the system works. We embrace that burden of proof. So what I'm about to say in no way is intended to diminish that responsibility that's so sacred that's put on, as Mr. Spees referred to, the government in this case, the government of the people. But as you heard, there's two sides to every case. You heard ours. And having listened to the defense present their case, I'm thinking of the old Wendy's commercial. The old lady who opens up her hamburger and says, "Where's the beef?" But in this case, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence of this transfer event? Somehow, possibly, at some point in time, he was there with his family? That's nonsense. Nonsense. People were going in and out of that mall every day. It was Christmas. And the only DNA found on her dress and in that vehicle on another occasion was the DNA of Jerry Burns. Are you kidding me? A transfer event? Folks, we're reasonable people. We need to have evidence to show things, and there's no evidence of a transfer event in this case. Defense points out there's no witnesses here, so somehow we have to speculate about what happened. Well, Michelle Martinko is dead. I think we know what happened. I think we know where the evidence points as well. The tracks and the trails and the divergent paths all lead, no matter how you phrase it, all lead to one area. A 1972 Buick in a coal parking lot at Westdale Mall on December 19, 1979, where only two people's DNA was found. And the crime scene tells us all we need to know. Michelle Martinko's DNA and the DNA of the defendant, not in one, but two locations. Yes, this involves minute evidence. DNA is small. But as you heard, and as we now know in the society we live in, DNA possesses enormous information. And you have to get down small enough to be able to find it, but it's there. It's there in blood on this crime scene. I want to talk a little bit about the items being bundled together, packaged together, those type of things. I talked about that during our closing argument. But folks, again, as reasonable people, what do we learn about the fact that these items are bundled together? It shows us nothing but the clothing that was on Michelle Martinko's murdered body stayed together. And I agree with the defense. One of the things they said. There's no evidence of outside contamination. Did you hear Mr. Speed say that? I'm over here like, that's great. What are we doing here then? No evidence of outside contamination means that there's two individuals' DNA that have been on Michelle Martinko's clothing for 40 years, or 26 till the time this was developed. We looked at 17K, Exhibit 17K. Again, that's the evidence card. It looks like it contains some kind of clerical error on it or something like that. It's not an issue in this case. Again, no evidence of outside contamination. Couldn't agree more. The real point here, folks, is there's no indication that this evidence ever left police custody, law enforcement custody, state custody. So again, there's no scenario whatsoever where the DNA of Jerry Burns would come in and contaminate that clothing because it was there the whole time. No evidence presented. No scenario from that. So it remained in police custody. The crime scene in this case remained in police custody. Items were packaged together, and you heard Michael Peterson, the former director of the DCI lab. You heard Linda Sauer, her years of experience. You heard Michael Schmidt, his years of experience. You heard Paul Bush, the boss, come in. They all said, items packaged together, they're all on her. We're not concerned about any contamination, but we heard that word thrown out, that scary word, contamination. Her clothes can't contaminate each other. The only person we heard come in here and say that that was some kind of scary scenario was the paid defense expert, the one who doesn't work in a lab, the one who writes papers on how to create reasonable doubt. There's no evidence in this case that the scarf that was on Michelle Martinko, which the pictures clearly show, is indicative of the dress she wore as part of the outfit that she wore. There's no indication that scarf ever left police custody either, or that it ever left the items it was packaged with, given its obvious indication that it's part of what she was wearing that night. There's no indication that the scarf was anywhere else besides where the rest of the clothing was, and that was on Michelle's dead body. And where the DNA was found in this case, on her dress, on the Gearshift Selector. It's not some random place where you might find if there was this cross-contamination taking place. It's in very precise locations. On the dress she was wearing while she was stabbed to death. Not on the inside of the dress, not on some odd location, not on the inside of the pantyhose or on the toe of the pantyhose, or on the dress where she bled and where the perpetrator, who we've shown as Mr. Burns, bled. Precise location. It's on the Gearshift Selector, folks. Could it get more precise than that? Smeared on the Gearshift Selector. It's not some kind of accidental event. That's a purposeful, dare I say, transfer, not secondary, direct. Item F, F5, spot F5 on the dress from Exhibit F. Spent 26 years in government custody. 26 years. Spot was there the entire time until it was found in 2005 in a package that contained Michelle Martinko's clothing. And again, there's no evidence that Jerry Burns' DNA got there other than in 1979. And ladies and gentlemen, the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt, even though it's not necessarily an element of this case, but we contend we've proven beyond a reasonable doubt that that DNA on the dress came from the defendant's blood. Even if the defendant's DNA on her dress came from his saliva, skin cells, something like that, if it's not blood, it's still mixed with hers. That area is presumptive for blood. We know there's blood there. Let's say it's not his. Well, it's hers. His DNA is mixed with hers, and the only way that could happen is after she shed blood on her dress, his DNA ended up with it. So you can call it whatever you want, but that's his DNA mixed in the blood from her murder. We contend it's his blood, though. For 40 years, everyone involved in this case knew that Michelle Martinko died and was killed, knew how she was killed. Common sense and intuition now allow us to connect the dots. During this trial, evidence comes in as it's described. Sometimes questions have to be rephrased, but during closing arguments, we're now free, and during deliberations, you're now free to make the reasonable conclusions from the evidence. So I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge it's undisputed in this case that F5 wasn't tested for anything but blood. But also what's undisputed is it was tested twice for blood, and it was twice positive for blood. So yes, other substances can't be ruled out. But the only substance confirmed by the physical evidence, by the test that was done on the physical evidence, by the surrounding circumstances, and what's most supported by scientific findings in this case, as Paul Bush told us, was that it was blood. During his interview at the business and again in the transport car, the defendant never gave any circumstances that would indicate that his DNA on that dress was there from saliva or touch or any other form of DNA. So yes, none of the experts could definitively say the defendant's DNA at the crime scene originated from blood, but let's realize and acknowledge what that really means. Again, area F5 tested not once but twice. It's blood. because DNA is present in all substances, in all these substances, there's no way to tell from the DNA itself where it originated from. This doesn't mean you can't find it didn't come from blood. In fact, as I've stated over and over, that's the only reasonable conclusion from the evidence in this case. When we talked about burden of proof during jury selection, and again here when we're talking about jury instructions, we all agreed that the proof the state is held to is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not proof beyond all doubt, not proof beyond all possibilities. That is a hill that nobody can climb and nobody should have to, and that's not the way this all works. Decisions are based on evidence. We're not going to be able to prove beyond the realm of possibilities. We want to base it on the evidence. And where is the evidence of anybody else's DNA at this crime scene? Of the DNA on her dress or on the Gearshift Selector coming from any other source other than blood? By presenting a realm of possibilities, a world of an imagination, the defense wants you to rewrite the history of this case. And the state says, you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to rewrite the history based on guessing what happened when the evidence is right in front of you and shows what happened. The infinite, undocumented realm of possibilities is a super topic for philosophy class, but that's not where we are right now. We're in a court of law. The only reasonable explanation is that the defense DNA on this dress and on the Gearshift Selector is it's there from blood. The only scenario that will result in his blood and his DNA being on Michelle Martinko's dress is that he killed her. With respect to Defense Exhibit T1, Dr. Spence again said he would expect that there would be more blood, but also conceded in his own testimony that that chart and that number is not indicative of how much actual blood was present in that case. So that was a trick. Take a tiny number, make it seem really, really tiny, and let you folks think that there's some kind of minuscule amount there, but that T1 does not say that. T1 is not meant for that. And remember, still when we're analyzing this, at Area F5, the major contributor to that profile there was the male, was Mr. Burns, with only 2 alleles being present from Michelle. So are you telling me, is the defense telling you that you should conclude that we know there's blood there and it's from Michelle's blood only? When she's the minor contributor, it doesn't make any sense. As for the Gearshift Selector, we disagree with the interpretation provided by the defense. Consistently, as the Gearshift Selector has been analyzed in this case, there was blood found from 2 sources, or there was DNA from 2 sources, and it consistently pointed to the defendant, matching up at the loci to F5 from Linda Sauer's examination, and again at Bodie Labs. And the fact that nothing was found on the steering wheel, we heard, is not unusual. There wasn't much there, and you need about 3% of the blood to find an actual DNA on it. So that's not an unusual finding. It's not unusual, the DNA wasn't found in other locations. So as they're talking about how other places weren't looked for blood, they're also talking about all the places where it wasn't found too, which is interesting. This crime scene was extensively examined, but when it got to a point where a known profile was found for comparison, it would be negligent to not identify who that person was and figure out why their DNA is there. And that's exactly what investigators ended up doing. And when they got to that person, they didn't find an explanation. We heard Jerry Burns was far from his home, and his work was even farther away, so how could this have happened? Well, in saying that, in presenting that scenario, doesn't that make this idea of transfer DNA even more unlikely? How would you act? How would you act if the police showed up? Strangers showed up, the police showed up. How would you act if somebody came and said your DNA was on the crime scene, started implying you in a murder? Well, you know what I'd do? I'd say I didn't do it. You got the wrong guy. Not, I don't know. I don't think anything happened. I don't think so. Test the DNA. Let's wait for the test to come back. Give me a break. Sure, we can't guess how people could act, but we know how somebody would act when they're being accused of a murder they didn't do. And after a couple of those questions, I was not there that night. Really? How did that secondary transfer occur then? It's not a credible answer. I don't want to spend more time on Mr. Allison because we talked about him, but what I do want to say is this master manipulator, this career criminal, this person you can't trust, this person that would say anything to get himself a better deal or to give him a bargaining chip. Well, if that was the case, wouldn't Mr. Allison have came here and gave us a really good story about why this happened? Oh, he told me why he did it. This is exactly why. No, he didn't. The master manipulator didn't come in and say that. What he did say is he reported a few things that Mr. Burns said and Mr. Burns did. Not much of a master manipulator when he didn't give us everything about that. But you know what? He still gave us enough. And a master manipulator doesn't come and do something if he doesn't have a deal. Which he didn't have any kind of evidence of a deal here. So try all you want to smear Mr. Allison. He probably deserves it. He has a criminal record, but he's got no chips in this poker game. In closing, I know you guys are ready to take this case and begin your deliberations, but there's one more topic I want to visit. The defense just justified the statements that were made by Mr. Burns during his transport to the Cedar Rapids Police Department as if the defendant was pontificating that a person, some person, not him, but some person, would block out tragic memories. We have a different take. I want you to look at that squad car video. And when you do, you'll see an investigator who, through his efforts, finally broke the case. Found the person that killed Michelle Martinko and just finished the interview with that person where he didn't adamantly deny that he didn't do it. He only said, test the DNA, and I don't know, when asked about what happened that night. So Matt had found the person. He had arrested that person. The science and the defense non-committal responses ensured that the right person was under arrest. But as you saw by Matt's questions, his inquiry changed. To something he wanted to know, and something we all want to know. From did you do this to why? Why did you do this? And next to him in that squad car was Jerry Burns, age 64. Now an older man. Not the same man he was back in 1979. He had close to a lifetime behind him. What was going through his mind? As the younger investigator asked him why this happened, Mr. Burns wasn't ready at first to answer that question. So he changed the subject a few times. What had been going through his mind? What do you suppose is going through his mind? Well, you can see it be unveiled during that transport video. The questions he had to be asking himself during that long car ride. Some of the things that he implied in that earlier interview video. How did they get my DNA? How did they find me after all those years? told the police, he told Matt, well, the police have a tough job. I wouldn't want to do what you guys want to do. Then you hear him start making outwardly making plans for his incarceration. How was he going to get his medications? How was he going to get to his appointments? Pay people. Make sure his son could run the business. But the real question that he had to answer at that point in time was one that he had not had to answer for the prior 40 years. So he knew he had to provide some kind of answer. And as we heard, that answer wasn't, you got the wrong guy. This must be some kind of mistake. Somebody must be confused. Let's get this worked out. I got to get this worked out. What was his answer? What did he end up saying that moment to justify this brutal murder? From so many years ago where he was a different man, a younger man, one who drank too much, one who had made an awful and terrible decision, who had certain illicit motives when he approached Michelle Martinko, and knew what he had done once it had gotten out of his control. What he had to do. He knew what he had to do. He had to kill her so his life wouldn't be ruined, so it wouldn't be uprooted. What was he thinking at that video? Was he thinking at that point in time, at least he had the last 40 years to live with his family? Was he thinking he wished he would have cleaned up his mess? Was he trying to figure out how to explain such a hideous act? How does one explain that? Well, common human experiences and common sense tells us sometimes when you can't explain, you take yourself out of it. Because you're a different person now. So the way you decide to live with yourself is to block out the traumatic events. Because if you block it out, it never happened, right? But in this case, we know what happened. We know how it happened, and we know who did it. The evidence shows, beyond any reasonable doubt, the defendant killed Michelle Martinko. The evidence points in no other reasonable direction. And ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you so much for your time and your patience. The state of Iowa is asking you to enter a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maybanks.